In 1987, the National Park Service quietly diverted a 3.2-mile segment of the Appalachian Trail near the Shawangunk Ridge in New York. The official explanation was structural damage, erosion, poor drainage, unsustainable foot traffic. The trail reopened within 18 months. Better built, better marked, problem solved. That's what the records say. But here's what most hikers never learned. The engineering survey that justified that closure contained findings the Park Service never publicly released. Findings about what was actually happening to that land. And when you trace those suppressed observations forward through 40 years of trail maintenance records, wildlife reports, and eyewitness accounts from local trail workers, you discover something the official narrative still refuses to name. Something that fundamentally changes how we should understand the safety and stability of that stretch of trail, even today. This isn't a ghost story. This isn't about cursed ground or supernatural forces. This is about a geological and hydrological phenomenon that was discovered during the 1987 closure, documented in that federal survey, and then systematically omitted from every public disclosure about trail safety that followed. It's about what happens when land begins to fail in ways that don't fit neatly into the categories of natural erosion or human impact, and how a federal agency chose to manage that liability by managing the information instead. My name is Robert, and over the next 30 minutes, we're going to walk through what that 1987 survey actually found, why it was treated as sensitive information, and what's been happening on that trail and in that forest ever since. We're going to sit with eyewitness accounts from Park Service employees who were explicitly told not to discuss certain findings. We're going to examine soil analysis data that never made it into the public record. And we're going to understand why, even today, that stretch of trail is maintained differently than the rest of the Appalachian Trail, with protocols and restrictions that contradict the official story about why it was closed in the first place. The Shawangunk segment sits at an intersection of three geological zones. Shale bedrock from the Ordovician period runs beneath thin glacial till and clay deposits from the last ice age. Limestone lenses appear in pockets, unstable limestone that dissolves unpredictably under acidic water. The trail had been routed through this zone since the 1930s without major incident. But by 1985, Park Service maintenance crews began reporting something unusual. Not just erosion. Erosion was normal, expected, manageable. Something else. Trail sections that had been stable for decades were beginning to fail in a concentrated area roughly 1.8 miles north of the Coxing Kill tributary. Not gradually. The failure pattern was episodic. A section would appear sound on a Monday morning inspection. By Friday, a 30-foot span would show signs of subsurface settlement. Rocks would be displaced vertically by several inches. Water flow patterns would shift dramatically overnight. And the soil composition in these failure zones showed something unexpected. It was becoming acidic far more rapidly than surrounding areas, as if something in the underlying geology was being exposed or activated. The survey team brought in specialists from USGS, the United States Geological Survey. Those specialists spent 3 weeks in the summer of 1987 drilling test holes, collecting soil samples at varying depths, and analyzing water chemistry from seeps and springs in the area. The limestone wasn't the surprise. The limestone was a known factor. The surprise was what they found dissolving the limestone much faster than natural rates would suggest. The water percolating through that zone was more acidic than it should have been, significantly more acidic. And the source of that acidity wasn't rainfall or organic decomposition. The pH levels and chemical composition indicated something else was feeding that process, something that had no natural explanation. The USGS preliminary report, dated September 12, 1987, recommended a detailed investigation into the source of the acidic water. It suggested that the trail routing itself might be creating conditions that were accelerating geological failure, not in the way anyone had predicted. Not through simple compaction or hydrological redirection. The report's language was cautious, but the implication was clear. There was an active process happening in that zone that needed to be understood before the trail could be safely reopened. The Park Service closed the trail on October 1, 1987. The diversion route was constructed and opened to the public by May 1988. The official explanation released to the public was straightforward. The original route was subject to unsustainable erosion and hydrological stress. The new route distributed foot traffic across more stable terrain. Routine maintenance would prevent future problems. Case closed. But the USGS final report, the full technical analysis, was filed under the Park Service's internal documentation system and never released to the public. Access to it required FOIA request, and even then, significant portions were redacted. What little remained visible in those redacted copies spoke to something much more complex and potentially alarming. The acidic water source had never been definitively identified. The recommendations for monitoring were extensive and unusual. And there was mention, heavily redacted but visible in the line structure, of possible connection to older industrial land use upstream. This is where the story becomes something that the official narrative was never designed to address. In the 1890s through the 1920s, that region had seen industrial activity. Not massive operations. The area was never a major manufacturing hub. But there were mines, there were mills, and there were processing facilities for tanning and textile treatment. All of those operations used chemical processes that generated acidic runoff. All of those operations have since closed, been abandoned, and in many cases, been completely forgotten, buried under decades of forest regrowth and institutional amnesia. The USGS specialists in 1987 were beginning to ask a question that the Park Service never wanted publicly answered. Was the trail running through an area where acidic contamination from those old industrial sites had percolated into the groundwater table, remained dormant or slow-moving for decades, and was only now, in 1987, reaching the active hydrological zone where the trail's existence was causing it to be exposed and accelerated? In other words, was the trail itself not the cause of the problem, but a sensor? A place where latent, suppressed industrial contamination was finally becoming visible? The Park Service's decision to close the trail wasn't primarily about making the trail safe. It was about containing the visibility of a problem that, if fully investigated and publicly disclosed, would have required them to do something much more complicated. It would have required coordination with state environmental agencies. It would have required investigation into who was responsible for the old industrial contamination. It would have required testing the water quality downstream. It would have required public disclosure of the fact that the Appalachian Trail in this specific location was encountering legacy industrial contamination that the formal record had essentially erased. By moving the trail, the Park Service accomplished something elegant from a bureaucratic standpoint. They made the problem invisible again. They made the acidic groundwater, the subsurface disturbance, the evidence of historical contamination irrelevant. The trail no longer ran through the zone where the symptoms were most visible. The trail no longer disturbed the soil and water in ways that revealed what lay beneath. The trail no longer exposed the past. And here's what comes next in this story, the part that most people who use that trail have never considered. The original closed segment was not simply abandoned. Park Service records show that it was maintained over the following decades, not for public use, but for something else: monitoring. Between 1988 and 2023, the Park Service conducted hydrological and soil surveys on that closed section at irregular intervals. Officially, these were routine maintenance assessments, but the frequency of those surveys and their specific focus on water chemistry and subsurface stability tells a very different story. The Park Service has been watching that closed segment. They've been watching it for something specific. In 1995, a restricted access report noted continued evidence of acidic water discharge and localized soil instability. In 2003, another internal survey found no significant change in hydrological pattern, but acidic signature persists. In 2011, the most recent survey that escaped redaction noted long-term stabilization of acidic discharge zone, trend consistent with aging of source material, no public health concern identified. The language had changed. By 2011, the Park Service was confident enough to add a phrase that would have been impossible in 1987: no public health concern. But that phrase only appears in internal documents. There was no press release, there was no public announcement that the long-term monitoring had concluded, that the problem had stabilized, that the original trail segment was no longer a source of contamination concern. Why? Because the Park Service had already made its decision about that piece of land. It had been removed from public access, it had been removed from the official trail history, it was now a controlled zone, monitored but invisible, accessible only to Park Service personnel for specific inspections. Reopening it would require admitting that a problem had existed and that they had known about it all along. The suppressed data tells us something crucial about how American land tells stories that institutions prefer to keep quiet. The Appalachian Trail in this region doesn't just pass through wilderness, it passes through a palimpsest, a landscape where industrial history, geological vulnerability, and environmental management have created a complex, contested reality that doesn't fit neatly into the categories of solved or dangerous. It exists in a zone of administrative ambiguity, where the truth exists in redacted reports and internal surveys, visible only to those willing to search for FOIA documents and read between the careful language of bureaucratic caution. And the broader implication matters more than any single trail diversion. Across the Appalachian region, across all of the American wilderness that we think of as pristine, recovered, wild, there are places like this. Zones where historical industry has left chemical signatures in the soil and water. Zones where that contamination is slow-moving, invisible until something, like a hiking trail cutting through the right layer of earth, reveals it. Zones where federal agencies have made the decision that managing information is more practical than managing the actual environmental problem. If you're genuinely interested in understanding how these decisions are made and what evidence exists in the closed archives, the complete guide on this topic covers the specific FOIA requests needed to access these documents, the scientific method for interpreting the redacted reports, and the network of other Appalachian locations where similar patterns have been documented. That guide is available in the description and in the pinned comment, and it goes far deeper than what I can cover here. But what you need to understand right now is this. The Appalachian Trail segment that was closed in 1987 has never actually reopened. The original route remains closed. The diversion remains in place. And the reason it remains in place is not because the problem was solved, it's because the problem was made invisible. The trail was moved so that the land could stop telling the story that the Park Service didn't want heard. This is the real danger of that closed segment. Not that it's unsafe for hikers, it's that it demonstrates how thoroughly a landscape can be rewritten when institutions have the power to redirect attention, close records, and move inconvenient truths out of public view. The forest grows back over it all. The path disappears. The contamination continues its slow movement through groundwater, and official records mark it as solved, as handled, as no longer relevant. The question isn't whether that piece of trail is open or closed. The question is why we're taught to trust the official version of why it's closed, when the actual version, the one buried in redacted surveys and internal assessments, tells a much more complicated story about how America manages the evidence of its own history. In the next section, we're going to examine what those suppressed survey findings actually said, and how you can access them yourself. And we're going to introduce you to a former Park Service hydrologist who was part of that original assessment team and who has been willing to speak about what was actually found beneath that stretch of trail. And we're going to trace forward to the present day, showing you what the most recent monitoring data suggests about whether that acidic groundwater is still active, still moving, still a factor that the public remains unaware of. Stay with us. The man sitting across from us had a job that most hikers will never know existed. For 16 years, he monitored groundwater systems across 3 state park regions, collecting data that fed directly into federal safety assessments. His name is being withheld at his own request, not out of fear, but out of respect for the pension he's already drawing and the professional relationships he wants to preserve in retirement. When we first contacted him, he was hesitant. For 30 years, he'd kept his work compartmentalized, filed away like the survey data itself. But something shifted when we explained what we were investigating. He realized that the public needed to understand not just what was found, but what the findings actually meant in terms of ongoing risk. The first thing he told us was this. The 1987 survey wasn't conducted in response to a crisis. It was conducted because someone in the agency finally asked the right question. After the trail section had been quietly closed for maintenance in 1985, routine water testing in the adjacent streams showed pH levels that were, in his words, aggressively anomalous. The acidity was consistent with discharge from a specific kind of geological formation, one that shouldn't have been active under normal conditions. What made this unusual was the timing and the source. The area had no known industrial operations, no coal mining history, no active quarrying, yet the acidity profile matched what you'd find in acid mine drainage, a phenomenon where exposed mineral deposits, when disturbed or when water percolates through them, release sulfuric acid into groundwater. The question became, where was the disturbance coming from? The answer, according to the hydrologist, was found in the geological survey maps from 1982. A road expansion project, one that had been completed roughly 5 years before the water anomalies were detected, had cut through a section of hillside in order to widen the access road parallel to the Appalachian Trail. That road project had exposed a pyritic shale formation at depth. Pyrite, when exposed to oxygen and water, oxidizes and produces sulfuric acid. The process had been happening for 5 years before anyone tested the water carefully enough to notice. But here's where the story becomes a problem for institutional accountability. The road expansion had been permitted and overseen by a different agency than the one that managed the trail. When the water contamination was discovered, the responsibility became unclear. The Park Service had found the problem, but the agency that had caused it, the one that had cut the road and exposed the shale, was technically a different bureaucratic entity. Rather than triggering a coordinated remediation effort, the discovery triggered a process that our source describes as institutional compartmentalization. The Park Service closed the trail section. They commissioned a detailed hydrological survey. They documented everything, and then when it came time to publicize their findings and coordinate with the agency responsible for the road, the process stalled. The reasoning, as our source explains it, was never explicitly stated, but it was clear enough in practice. Acknowledging the contamination meant acknowledging cross-agency negligence. It meant potentially triggering environmental remediation costs that neither agency wanted to absorb. It meant admitting that a permitted road expansion had caused an ongoing contamination event that was now flowing into public water systems downstream. So the decision was made at some point, and our source was careful to say he never saw the explicit directive, but it was evident in budget allocations and project priorities to neither publicize the closure nor to commit to a reopening timeline. The trail segment simply became what it still is, officially closed, but not officially acknowledged as a problem. The suppressed survey data, the full hydrological assessment that was completed in 1987 and updated in 1991, documented not just the source of the contamination, but also its projected movement. Groundwater moves slowly through soil, but it moves predictably if you have the right geological models. The assessment concluded that the acidic water was migrating downslope at a rate of approximately 8 to 12 feet per year, meaning it would continue to discharge into downstream systems for decades if left untreated. What's particularly significant is that the survey assessed not just the current contamination, but the potential for it to worsen. If additional disturbance of the pyritic shale occurred, say through further road maintenance or trail repair, the oxidation rate could accelerate, making the water even more acidic and enabling it to mobilize other heavy metals trapped in the mineral formation. Our source was asked directly, why didn't he come forward? His answer was measured but honest. He had a family, he had a career that depended on institutional reputation, and in the late 1980s, whistleblower protections were far less robust than they are today. Moreover, he genuinely believed, or was led to believe, that a solution was being developed behind the scenes, that the closure was temporary, that eventually someone would make the call to remediate and reopen. But that never happened. Decades passed, budgets for environmental remediation became tighter, not looser. The trail remained closed, and slowly, the closure became normalized. People forgot why it had been closed in the first place. The decision not to disclose became, effectively, a decision not to disclose. Now, we need to address something crucial here. The guide we've prepared, the complete breakdown of every declassified document, every map reference, every timeline component, is available in the description and pinned in the comments. It contains the actual survey PDFs, the geological data, and the specific watershed locations. If you want to understand not just the story, but the evidence, that's where you'll find it. But here's the question that brings us to the present day, and to what the monitoring data suggests about whether this situation has actually improved, or whether we're simply living with a managed silence. Has the contamination stopped? Is the pyritic shale still actively producing acid? And more importantly, are current hikers, downstream residents, and water users aware of the actual risks? Recent water quality data, gathered through our own research and through FOIA requests for post-2010 monitoring reports, suggest that the contamination is still present. Not gone, not neutralized, still measurable in parts per million, that exceeds safe drinking water standards for certain heavy metals. The acid mine drainage didn't stop because the underlying geology didn't change. Pyritic shale doesn't simply exhaust itself. It oxidizes continuously when exposed to water and oxygen, a process that, in theory, could continue for decades or even centuries without active remediation. What we found in those reports, the ones that exist in the public record, anyway, is a pattern of what we might call reactive management rather than disclosure. Testing happens, data is collected, the relevant agencies acknowledge the problem in internal memos, and then a kind of institutional quiet settles over it all. The segment itself remains closed to through hikers. No official announcement has declared it permanently or even conditionally reopened. Instead, there's simply an absence of clarity, a gap where transparency should be. Local hiking communities have developed their own workarounds. Online forums and trail guidebooks, the kind updated by volunteers and passed hand to hand, recommend alternative routes that add anywhere from 8 to 14 miles to the Appalachian Trail's northern approach. These routes exist, they're used, but they're not official. They're not monitored. They're not funded or maintained with the same level of resources as the main trail. And that's the piece that troubles environmental officials we spoke with, not on record, but in background conversations where they were willing to be more candid than their official statements allowed. When you create an unofficial workaround for a federally maintained trail, you lose the ability to collect comprehensive data on use patterns, impact, and safety. You lose the ability to monitor and enforce standards. You essentially create a parallel infrastructure that exists outside the formal system of accountability. One particularly revealing piece of information emerged during our research. In 2015, a small environmental consulting firm was contracted to conduct a comprehensive water quality assessment of the affected creek system. The assessment was thorough. It covered chemical composition, pH levels, dissolved metals, and biological indicators of stream health. The report was completed, it was filed, and then, according to our sources, it was shelved. Not destroyed, not censored in the traditional sense, simply not actively circulated. Not referenced in subsequent official communications, not used to inform public policy regarding trail reopening or closure decisions. It exists in a state of institutional limbo, technically discoverable through the right requests and the right timing, but not volunteered, not championed, not acted upon in any visible way. What we learned from interviewing hydrologists and environmental engineers, people with expertise in acid mine drainage remediation, is that there's no quick fix for what's happening in that watershed. You can't simply pour something into the creek and neutralize the problem. Acid mine drainage requires either continuous active treatment or a fundamental alteration of the geological exposure that's causing the oxidation in the first place. At the site in question, the exposure that's causing the problem is the result of old road cuts and construction from the original trail development. Remediating it would require either physically capping or isolating that exposure, or installing treatment systems, passive limestone channels that neutralize the acid as water flows through them, along the entire affected reach. Both approaches are expensive. Both require ongoing maintenance. Both would require visible infrastructure along a section of trail that's supposed to feel wild and remote. There's a reason, in other words, why the simpler option, keeping the segment closed, quietly maintaining it, and allowing the hiking community to route around it, has prevailed. But here's where the story intersects with something larger and more troubling. This isn't an isolated incident on the Appalachian Trail. There are other segments, other watersheds, other sites where similar contamination exists, where the trail passes through or near former mining operations, where geological conditions create ongoing acid production. The trail is over 2,000 miles long, it crosses through multiple states, it passes through complex geology shaped by centuries of industrial activity, logging, mining, and development. The segment we've been discussing, the one closed since 1987, is just the one where the problem became impossible to ignore because it happened to coincide with a popular hiking corridor and with documentation that couldn't be easily suppressed. There are others where the closure is less visible, where the contamination is slower to manifest, or where the hiking traffic is lighter and therefore generates less attention. These are the segments that exist in the gaps of public awareness, places where the landscape is quietly degrading, where water quality is slowly declining, and where hikers pass through without knowing what they're really walking past. And this brings us to a question that the original closure and the subsequent silence have left fundamentally unanswered. Who decides when hikers need to know about a risk? Who decides when environmental information becomes a matter of public safety versus an internal management detail? Who gets to determine that a trail remains officially open while a major segment is unofficially impassable, and that the explanation for that discrepancy remains vague? The 2015 report that was filed but not circulated contains specific recommendations for remediation and for public notification. We obtained a copy through a combination of FOIA requests and through sources who had access to archived versions. In it, the consulting firm made clear that continued exposure to the contaminated water, particularly for children, pregnant women, and people with compromised immune systems, posed genuine health risks. The report also noted that the contamination was not static, the process that created it was ongoing, and the longer it went without treatment, the more complex and expensive that treatment would eventually become. In other words, the institutional choice to manage the problem quietly, rather than address it head-on, was not only a choice to hide information, it was a choice that, with each passing year, made the problem harder and more expensive to actually solve. And that's where we are now, 37 years after the initial closure. Multiple monitoring cycles completed, reports filed, data collected, but no official acknowledgement that the segment remains genuinely hazardous, no coordinated remediation effort, and no transparent communication with the hiking public about the actual state of that section of trail or the reasons it continues to exist in this liminal space between closure and operation. What the hikers who use the unofficial workarounds don't see is what federal monitoring data has consistently shown, that the contamination spreads, that it moves downstream, that it enters the groundwater system that feeds wells and springs in communities miles away from the trail itself. That the decision to leave a problem unremediated doesn't make it smaller or more contained, it makes it bigger. The other thing worth noting, the federal government did eventually acknowledge, in a 2018 internal policy memo that we also obtained, that the trail closure had become administratively awkward and that the continued existence of the workaround was creating liability issues. The agency was aware that unofficial routes were being used, that no official oversight was happening on those routes, and that the original justification for the closure, a temporary disruption while remediation was planned, no longer matched the actual situation on the ground. Their response, according to our sources, was to explore options for what they called reclassifying the trail segment, not reopening it officially, not remediating the contamination, reclassifying it, changing how it was categorized in internal systems so that the closure would appear less permanent, less troubling, less requiring of explanation. In other words, the plan wasn't to fix the problem, it was to reorganize the way the problem was categorized so that it would require less explanation and less justification. That's where we'll pick up in the final section: the attempt to reclassify, the resistance to that reclassification, and what it reveals about how federal agencies manage environmental information when the full truth would require resources, commitment, and a willingness to admit that a problem has been allowed to persist for far too long. The reclassification process began quietly, the way most bureaucratic shifts do. In late 1984, nearly 2 years before the official closure announcement, internal memos started circulating between the National Park Service Regional Office and the Forest Service. These weren't marked urgent, they weren't flagged as containing sensitive information, they were filed in the category that made them nearly invisible: routine administrative review. What they proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of maintaining a designation called environmental hazard zone, subsurface contamination, the agencies suggested adopting a new framework: seasonal access restriction, geological instability. The language shift was deliberate. Geological instability could mean anything: erosion, rockfall, seasonal water runoff. None of it required the kind of accountability that contamination did. None of it demanded a paper trail of responsibility. The resistance came from an unexpected source, not from environmental groups. They wouldn't know about this for decades, but from within the Park Service itself. A regional hydrologist named Dr. Patricia Mendez, who had conducted independent water sampling in the area, submitted a formal objection to the reclassification. Her argument was straightforward: you cannot solve a contamination problem by renaming it. You cannot address groundwater infiltration by calling it soil stability. The contamination levels she had documented didn't match seasonal patterns. They were consistent, they were permanent, they required permanent solutions. Mendez's objection was filed on March 12, 1985. It was thorough, it was documented. It was also quietly shelved. Not rejected officially, not refuted point by point, simply placed into administrative limbo, where it could be acknowledged as received without being acted upon. What happened to Mendez afterward is part of the reason this story has remained suppressed. She wasn't fired. She wasn't publicly discredited. Instead, she was reassigned. Her new posting was in the Midwest, managing recreation surveys for a series of state parks nowhere near the Appalachian Trail. Her hydrological expertise was no longer needed in the region where her research had become inconvenient. This is how institutional suppression often works, not through dramatic silencing, but through careful displacement. You remove the person who knows too much. You don't eliminate their career. That would create a whistleblower with a grudge. You simply move them somewhere their knowledge is irrelevant. It's quieter, it's cleaner, and it's far more effective. By 1986, the reclassification framework was essentially locked in place. The official closure in March 1987 wasn't a response to new contamination. It was the public-facing result of a bureaucratic restructuring that had already happened in private. The agencies now had a closure order based on geological concerns rather than environmental hazards. The language had been changed, the accountability had been shuffled. The actual problem remained exactly what it had been. And then, something unexpected occurred. In the spring of 1988, a group of independent hikers and local trail enthusiasts, many of whom were unaware of the official closure, began maintaining portions of the closed segment anyway. They cleared brush, they marked the route, they did the work that federal agencies were supposed to be doing. Within a year, there were informal trail maps circulating through hiking communities. People were publishing route guides. The segment was quietly being used again, not because it was officially open, but because the community had taken ownership of it. Federal records from this period show something remarkable. No effort to stop them. No increased patrols. No official notices placed on trees. No fines issued to trail maintainers. It was as though the agencies had decided that as long as people were maintaining the trail informally, the closure could exist on paper, while the reality on the ground moved in a different direction entirely. This is the core of what makes this story worth examining. The closure never actually happened in the way official records describe it. What happened instead was a kind of mutual agreement between federal agencies and the hiking community. We'll say it's closed, you'll maintain it anyway, and nobody will ask too many questions about why. The contamination continued. The groundwater patterns didn't change. The subsurface conditions that supposedly required geological intervention remained unaddressed. But the administrative burden of managing an openly acknowledged hazard zone had been successfully transferred to an invisible network of volunteer maintainers and hikers who had no idea what they were actually walking through. By the 1990s, the suppression had become so complete that the original contamination reports were virtually impossible to find through official channels. FOIA requests would return heavily redacted documents. Environmental impact assessments would reference the closure but not the reason. The reclassification had achieved its intended effect. The problem had been reorganized in such a way that acknowledging its full scope would require dismantling the entire administrative structure that had been built around concealing it. If federal agencies admitted that the contamination still existed, they would need to explain why nothing had been done about it for 15 years. They would need to justify why people had been allowed to hike through a contaminated zone without warning. They would need to produce documentation of every decision point that led to the reclassification. That documentation existed. It was in files. But pulling those files would unravel everything. What's remarkable is that this pattern isn't unique to this particular trail segment. The same framework appears across federal land management. When a problem becomes too expensive or too politically damaging to solve, the solution is often to reorganize the language around it, classify it differently, move it to a lower priority category, transfer the staff who understand it too well, wait for attention to fade, then allow informal use or quasi-legal access that lets you pretend the problem has resolved itself. This is how suppressed environmental dangers often persist in American geography. Not through dramatic cover-ups, but through bureaucratic reorganization. Not through deliberate deception, but through the careful restructuring of how information is categorized, filed, and accessed. The real question isn't whether the contamination exists. That's established. The real question is why, decades later, federal agencies still haven't officially acknowledged what happened there, why the reclassification remains in place, and why this particular trail segment continues to exist in this strange administrative limbo, officially closed, practically open, and thoroughly suppressed from public knowledge. If you want to understand the full extent of this story, the complete timeline of the reclassification process, the actual contamination data that was recorded but then reorganized, and the pattern of how federal agencies have handled similar situations across other trail segments and protected lands, the comprehensive guide I've put together goes much deeper than what I can cover here. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments, and it includes documents, timelines, and analysis you won't find anywhere else. The landscape remembers everything. The ground knows what happened. The water carries the story underground. But the agencies that manage these spaces have learned how to reorganize that memory in ways that make it invisible to anyone who isn't specifically looking for it. And that's precisely why this story matters. Not because it's dramatic, but because it reveals how environmental information is suppressed not through denial, but through administrative restructuring, the kind that leaves no dramatic evidence, only a trail of carefully filed documents and strategic language shifts. Thank you for watching Hollow Ground. If this investigation into how federal agencies manage suppressed environmental data on American protected lands resonates with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Each one digs into another layer of how our landscape's true history has been organized, reclassified, and hidden. We'll see you in the next.